Hello, this is Jubilee again, and we're going to be doing another TA review. This is quiz 10, and this week we are just doing respiratory system. So hopefully this will be a nice little break for you guys. You only have to do one system instead of two this week. But yeah, let's go ahead and get started. So first we're going to kind of talk about the main functions of the respiratory system. So the respiratory system is, your nose, your trachea, everything, and then your lungs. Right? And so the main function of your respiratory system is gas exchange. But in order to get to that gas exchange part first, we have to go through the conducting portion of the respiratory system. So your respiratory system is basically divided into two main portions. Everybody thinks of the respiratory portion, obviously, whenever they think of the respiratory system, but the conducting portion is just as important. And so what the conducting portion does is that's kind of the earlier parts in your respiratory system. And what it does is it cleans, humidifies, and warms air, right? So it's kind of preparing that air for your lungs so that it's nice, it's clean, it's humid, and it's warm before it gets to that lung tissue. Because if you think about it, like when you go on a run and it's really cold outside or something like that, and you're breathing in all of this really cold air, that burns your lungs. Right? It's not a very pleasant feeling. And that's because what you're doing is you're breathing in so much cold air that you're overwhelming this conducting portion of your respiratory system. And so it's not doing as good of a job at humidifying and warming the air and everything like that. So it doesn't feel very pleasant, right? And so that's what your conducting portion of your respiratory system is trying to do. It's trying to prepare this air so that when it enters your body and it enters the tissues of your lungs, it doesn't burn and it's prepared nicely and it's nice and warm and humid because that's how we need it to be. And what helps a lot with that is the mucus that's constantly being produced by the cells in your respiratory system. And so the functions of mucus, there's a lot of functions, but it's going to help detoxify gas, right? That helps clean it. It's going to present odor chemicals to the olfactory cells. So the chemicals that produce scent and that you pick up as smelling like something actually need to be dissolved in the mucus in order for those olfactory cells to pick up that scent. So the mucus really helps with that. It also washes away old chemicals or scents so that new scents can be there, right? So you're constantly washing mucus away so that you can smell new things and stuff like that. It traps and clears dust, right? So that's important. And then it also contains antibodies. And so that's, again, just going to help because you're constantly breathing in germs, inhaling germs, and we don't want that to get down into the tissues of your lungs. So the mucus is going to help that with a bunch of antibodies and stuff. Okay, and then once we've prepared this air and we make it nice and perfect and warm, we get down into the respiratory portion of this respiratory system, and that's the actual site of gas exchange, right? That's what everybody thinks about when they think of the respiratory system. So that's deep down in your lungs, and that's where you're exchanging CO2 for O2, right? Because we constantly need new oxygen. That's what helps us make ATP, right? Energy for our cells. So we constantly need a new source of oxygen, and then we're constantly producing CO2 as a waste product, right? So we need to exchange one for the other in this respiratory portion of the respiratory system. Okay, so now we're kind of going to talk about how you inhale, and it's basically physics, right? Is how you're inhaling. And so I don't know how much physics background y'all have, but basically anytime you increase the area of something, so like if I take a bag that's closed and I open it up, I'm increasing the surface area. That decreases the pressure within that bag. And so the higher pressure outside of the bag, the higher pressured air outside of the bag has to flow inside into the lower pressured area inside the bag. And so whenever I'm opening up that bag and filling up that bag, I'm filling it up with air, right? Because air's flowing into it. And that's just because that's the way physics works, that air has to flow from places of higher pressure and higher concentration to places of lower pressure and lower concentration, right? So if the whole goal of the respiratory system is to get air in and out of our lungs, and we want to inflate our lungs with air, we need to increase the size of our lungs, right? If I increase the size, it's like filling a bag up with air, so air is going to get sucked down into our lungs, and then we can collapse it and make the air come back out, right? So that's how we inhale and exhale. And so these are kind of the main parts, that mechanical parts that are going to help with that, right? So your rib cage is a fixed bony cavity, right? So your rib cage is right here, and your lungs are basically attached to the outside of it, right? And so if I raise the rib cage up, that's going to create a larger area in this space. And then if I squish it down and compress it down, that's going to create a smaller area, right? So if we raise it up, that's going to force air into your lungs. If I squish it down, it's going to force air out of your lungs, right? And so there are a bunch of muscles that attach to your rib cage and stuff like that to make it move up and down. But right, that's why whenever you take a deep breath in, your rib cage rises, and then whenever you take a deep breath out, your rib cage goes down. Your diaphragm also helps with that. And so that's this flat muscle right here, and that's what everybody kind of thinks about as the main muscle that helps in inhalation. And so what happens is whenever it contracts, it's going to flatten out. So you see how it's domed right here and it's taking up this space. Whenever it flattens out, that's going to make this area bigger, and that's going to suck in air. So your diaphragm helps for inspiration. Okay, it doesn't really help for expiration, but it helps for inspiration by making that area bigger. Okay, your intercostal muscles, so those are just muscles in between your rib cage. Those again are going to help your rib cage move up and down in a kind of complicated way. So they help with inspiration and expiration. And your internal intercostal muscles are going to help more with expiration, and your external intercostal muscles are going to help more with inspiration. Okay, so it's kind of complicated, and you guys don't have to get into all the mechanics of it, but basically just know that, right? So they're kind of flipped, right? Internal expiration, external inspiration. And then your lungs, just the natural elasticity of your lungs is going to naturally want to collapse, right? So the way most people kind of think about it is that inhalation is an active process, right? It takes effort, it takes muscles to move and stuff like that, right? So inspiration is an active process, and then expiration is more of a passive process, right? So if I tell you take a deep breath in and then relax, all you have to do is relax, and then the natural elasticity of your lungs are just going to want to collapse naturally, right? They just naturally want to be collapsed. You have to put in effort to fill them up with all those muscles, and then they're naturally going to collapse. Okay, so that's a passive process. If you're breathing really hard and you have to exhale really quickly, faster than it takes you to just relax and for your lungs to naturally collapse, that's where you have active expiration. And that's where you need, your internal intercostal muscles and other muscles to help you with that. Okay, so don't get too messed up in it. Just kind of know what helps you with inspiration, what helps you with expiration, and just know that inspiration is always an active process. Okay, so kind of the first portion of the conducting portion of your respiratory system is going to be the nose. And this is really going to help warm, humidify, and clean the air, right? But it also has your sense of smell, right? It's the site of olfaction. And so this is kind of a cross-section of your nasal cavity. This is a cross-section of your nasal cavity. And so within the nasal fossae, you have these things called conchae. And so you have a superior, middle, and inferior conchae. And basically these are just a bunch of little scrolls and channels that the air has to go through. And it increases the surface area that they have to go through this, and it really helps to warm, humidify, and clean the air that's going through all of these conchae and winding down in here. Okay, And then more towards the beginning of your nose, your nasal cavity, you have olfactory epithelium and nervous tissue, right? So your olfactory epithelium is what gives you your sense of smell, and then you have nervous tissue because you have all those nerve endings up there that want to pick up whatever chemicals you're receiving in there, right? And transmit it to your brain. And then your middle conchae and inferior conchae mainly have respiratory epithelium. Okay, and we're going to talk about what both of these types of epithelium look like in a second, but that's what's really going to help to warm and humidify the air that's going through there. Okay, in your nose, you also have these things called swell bodies, and we'll look at a closer up picture of them. But basically, they're these large vascular areas. So they're just really big vascular areas, and so they can fill up with blood and swell up, and so it can occlude and direct air. Okay, so they can swell up, and so that's kind of like a thing that people associate with allergies as well. So if you have allergies, right, your nose gets all stuffy and you can't even breathe out of your nose. And that's actually kind of a protective mechanism. So like if you get sick, it's a protective mechanism. If you're breathing in a bunch of germs and stuff like that, your body's going to want to close this off so that not as many germs can get through. And so that's what your swell bodies are trying to do. Whenever you have allergies, allergies are just an overreaction to pollen or something like that, where they think it's something bad, so they're going to close off anyways. But that's what your swell bodies help do. They can occlude and direct air within your nasal cavity. And then an important thing, so we said the conducting portion warms air going into your respiratory system. And so the way that it does it, your nose is really good at warming the air that enters it. And it does that through counter current exchange. And basically what that means is we constantly have air going in this way, and then we constantly have warm blood going out this way, right? And so instead of just letting the blood and the air mix on their own and then becoming, whatever temperatures in the middle of the cold air and the warm blood, what happens is we're constantly bringing in fresh, warm blood to meet this very cold air, right? So they don't meet in the middle of their temperatures. It's not like you're going to meet in a cool medium. What's going to happen is you're constantly bringing in warm air. So by the time the air gets all the way through the nose, it's actually about the same temperature as what's in the nose instead of in a happy medium, if that makes sense. So it's like constantly running hot water over something as opposed to just putting it in hot water, if that makes sense. So that's what countercurrent exchange is. It just means we're constantly bringing in new warm blood in the opposite direction that the cool air is flowing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about olfactory epithelium. And remember we said this is in that first portion of your nose, your nasal cavity, where you can smell. So yeah, olfaction is your sense of smell. And so you have a special type of epithelium. And again, this is called olfactory epithelium. And it is pseudostratified columnar epithelium, but it does not have goblet cells. So it's not the same as respiratory epithelium that we're going to see later. Okay, so there's no goblet cells in here. It is pseudostratified columnar, right? So one layer of columnar cells that looks like it might be more than one layers, but it's really not. And then at the top, it has all these little nerve endings projecting out of it. Okay, so it's not the same as cilia that we're going to see in a second in the respiratory epithelium. But it has tiny little nerve endings poking out. And that's again to help you transmit whatever signals, whatever you're smelling up here to your brain, right? And so we also have nerves down here below the olfactory epithelium. So these are going to be little bundles of nerves picking up all of those signals of whatever you're smelling. And then we also have Bowman's glands. So Bowman's glands are going to be these kind of darker red bundles in here. Okay, and those are glands that are secreting mucin, which, is a product of mucus, or it's a part of mucus, right? So we're secreting mucin, so we're going to have a bunch of mucus up here, and again, that helps humidify the air, right? So we're already starting to help humidify the air. And then also it's highly vascular, right? There's a lot of blood vessels in here, in your nose. Okay, so now we're looking at respiratory epithelium, and remember we said that's more towards the back of your nose, and then we'll see it's further down the conducting portion of your respiratory system. So now we have respiratory epithelium, and it looks similar, but it's not the same, right? So it's also pseudostratified epithelium, but this epithelium has goblet cells in respiratory epithelium, and it has cilia. Right, so you see how it has all of these cilia and it's really thick at the top here, that brush border, and then it has these big goblet cells that are producing mucus. So that's respiratory epithelium. Okay, so yeah, it's also highly vascularized. There's a bunch of big blood vessels right here. Right, there's some plasma cells producing antibodies. But yeah, that's respiratory epithelium. So just make sure you can tell the difference between this one and this one that doesn't have goblet cells and doesn't have that thick brush border at the top. Okay, so here is a comparison of the two right next to each other. So this is in the nose, right, where we said we have both of the different kinds of epithelium, right? The olfactory epithelium would be more towards the beginning of the nose. And right here you can see there's no brush border. It is pseudostratified, columnar, right? And then we've got those Bowman's glands and those nerve bundles underneath, right? And see how that looks different than the lamina propria under the respiratory epithelium. So this would be respiratory epithelium, and that's that pseudostratified columnar with little goblet cells in there. And then if you could zoom in, you would see there's a brush border right there, okay? So just make sure you can tell the difference between this and this, right? The Bowman's glands and everything really help you identify olfactory epithelium as well. Okay, so after we go through the nose, then we get to the trachea. Okay, and the way that you can tell it's the trachea is completely lined with cartilage. Okay, it has really big cartilaginous rings around it. So yeah, so all of this is cartilage, and that's the trachea. That's the esophagus up there, and so within the trachea you have respiratory epithelium all the way around it. So if we zoomed in, it would be that same pseudostratified columnar ciliated epithelium with those goblet cells, right? That's what we call respiratory epithelium. It also has glands in the submucosa, and then there's a ton of smooth muscle, right? And that smooth muscle helps to either constrict or dilate your trachea, right? So whenever you're sick or whenever you are going for a run and you really need to dilate your trachea because you need to breathe in deep. Okay. So now we're going to talk about the direction of airflow, right? So we talked about the nose, we talked about the trachea and how the trachea has continuous cartilage. And after we go through the trachea, we go down and it branches into two branches, and those are called bronchi. So the singular is bronchus. So it branches, one to the left lung, one to the right lung, and those are your bronchi. And the way you can tell you're at the level of the bronchi on cross-section is it's not as thick and complete of a ring of cartilage as in the trachea, but you do still have cartilaginous plates. So you see these cartilage plates right here? That's how we know this is a bronchus. Okay? That's how we know that's a bronchus. And then after that, each bronchus going into the lungs is going to divide again into conducting bronchioles. Okay, so they're all going to divide again, and that's going to make a bunch of conducting bronchioles. And the way you can tell it's a conducting bronchiole at that level is there's no more cartilage, right? You see how there's no cartilage. There is smooth muscle, right? But there's no cartilage anywhere around here. Okay, so now we're in a conducting bronchiole. Then we're going to go from the conducting bronchioles into the respiratory bronchioles. Okay, so here you can see that happening, and you can see there's a change of the epithelium happening, right? So we're going away from that respiratory epithelium that we had before into just the tissue of the lung, right, where we want gas exchange to occur, right? Because now we're changing from the conducting portion to the respiratory portion. So the portion that's going to warm and humidify everything to now we're starting to get to the part where gas exchange is going to occur. So now we're in the respiratory bronchioles. Okay, the bronchioles are going to split even more into little alveolar ducts, and then alveolar sacs. We zoom in more, and each of those alveolar sacs is going to contain little alveoli, and so that's at the smallest level. Okay, so that's at the cellular level, the alveoli, and that is where most of the gas exchange is going to occur, right at the very end of the respiratory portion. And so you can see how the walls, so this would be like one alveoli, one sac in the alveoli, one little ball, and you can see how it's just one cell thick, right? It's super thin, the lining, and then we've got a blood vessel right here, right? So we have gas in these alveoli, we have blood in this blood vessel, and here is where our gas exchange is going to occur. Or, well, I guess it would happen at the capillary, sorry. Right here is where a gas exchange would occur. That's a little arterial, but anyways. Okay, so here we're going to look at more examples of that. So if I were to ask you maybe what you thought this big tube was, hopefully you would tell me you think it's a bronchus, right? Because you see these cartilaginous plates right here. You've got some cartilaginous plates surrounding this. It's really big, really thick, but it's not like the trachea, right? There's only one trachea. It's not a complete huge ring of cartilage, but there are cartilage plates, right? So that would still be a bronchus. This one right here, where there's no cartilage around it, that would be like a bronchiole, a conducting bronchiole. Okay. Here we can see this is more cartilage, right? This is hyaline cartilage. We can also see some glands in here producing mucus, and we can see that respiratory epithelium, right? That pseudostratified, ciliated respiratory epithelium with a bunch of goblet cells in there. Okay, and here we can see more of the same, right, in an even smaller one. Okay, and so once we get towards the end of the conducting portion and a little more towards the respiratory portion of the lungs, we start to get these different kinds of cells called Claire cells or Clara cells. And basically they just secrete products that are going to protect the bronchial lining. Okay. And so as we get away from the respiratory epithelium with their cilia and we start having some of these Claire cells that don't have cilia, we get more and more Claire cells and we get less and less goblet cells and that pseudostratified epithelium. So these are those Claire cells right here, and they're really fat and bubbly. Okay, there's a bunch of Claire cells. And that's just trying to protect, because now we're getting to the respiratory portion where everything's really thin and delicate, right? And we're trying to preserve everything. So that's what those Claire cells are doing. They're trying to protect the bronchial lining. Okay, we've also got smooth muscle here, and we've got elastic fibers connecting that epithelium down. Okay, so now we're going to talk about cells in the lungs. So this is once we get towards the respiratory portion, right, where our actual gas exchange is going to occur, where we have all our alveoli. And so in the lung, we have mesothelium like we do in every organ. So this is the very outside of the lung. Okay, so this is within the lung with alveoli, and then this is just empty space outside of the lung. Okay, this is not part of the lung or space within the lung. And so that one cell thick lining on the outside of the lung, just like in every organ, is going to be our mesothelium, right? It's a type of epithelium that lines organs. So that's our mesothelium right there. And then within the lung, we have a bunch of different types of cells, right? So we have what's called a type 1 pneumocyte, right? That basically means lung cell, a type 1 pneumocyte. And those are responsible for gas exchange, right? And so if we think of what kind of cell we'd want it to look like if we want gas exchange to occur, we want it to be very thin, right? Because we're trying to exchange gas from here to here, right? We want O2 to go in and CO2 to go out. So we want these cells to be really thin. So if you look for a type 1 pneumocyte, they're going to be really flat and thin. So you see how this cell is really flat and thin. You see how this cell is really flat and thin, flat and thin. Those would be your type 1 pneumocytes. Okay, and those are responsible for gas exchange, where gas exchange would occur. Okay, and then type 2 pneumocytes are the other kinds, and those are going to release surfactant. Okay, and that's a product that we need in these alveoli. We're going to talk a little bit more about surfactant in a second, but if you think of what a cell that's producing things, that's secreting things would look like, you'd think it'd be kind of fat and bubbly and have a lot of cytoplasm, right? So that's what a type 2 pneumocyte is going to look like. It's going to be really fat and bubbly, okay? So it's going to be these more plump cells within there. You also have macrophages in the lungs, right? Because they're eating up germs and stuff like that, dead cells, any bad stuff that you've breathed in. So this is going to be a little air macrophage in there, trying to eat up any junk that you've inhaled. You've also got mast cells that we'll see in a second, and those again help with inflammatory responses. And then we've also got endothelium, right? Anytime we have a blood vessel, we have endothelial cells. And so you can see all of these dark red places are little capillaries. And so lining each one of these capillaries, there is a little endothelial cell, okay? It's hard to see them sometimes, but in some of the bigger capillaries, you can see little endothelial cells lining them. Okay, so here we're going to practice some more. So here you can see, right, there's red blood cells in this little capillary, so that's how I know it's a capillary, and you can see this very flat cell lining it, right? And so that's an endothelial cell, right? And so if you get confused and think maybe it's a type 1 pneumocyte, just know that endothelial cells are flat, type 1 pneumocytes are flat, right? But the type 1 pneumocytes are a part of the lung, not a part of the capillary, right? A part of the lung tissue, not a part of the capillary. Okay, so that would be an endothelial cell. So this would be a type 1 pneumocyte. So you see how it's not lining a capillary, but it is very flat. So that's for gas exchange. So that would be a type 1 pneumocyte. Right here would be another type 1 pneumocyte. This big fat one right here would be a type 2 pneumocyte. Okay, maybe this big fat one right here would be a type 2 pneumocyte. This big one right here would be a macrophage, an air macrophage. You see how it's kind of not connected to any of this right here? How it's just kind of floating around doing its own thing. That's kind of how I know it's an air macrophage. Okay. And then here you can see this would be a mast cell and this would be a mast cell. So they're not super common in the lungs. They're kind of rare, but they have that very distinct mast cell appearance where the cytoplasm is actually more blue than the actual nucleus of the mast cell, which is different than most cells, right? Okay, so products in the lungs. So we talked about how the type 2 pneumocytes produce surfactant, right? And so what they're doing in the lungs is this surfactant that they're producing is going to reduce the surface tension in the lung alveoli. Okay, and that's really important for the alveoli. And basically what it does is by reducing the surface tension, it keeps the alveoli from sticking to itself and collapsing. Okay, and so when you think about surface tension, that's kind of basically what it is whenever you have an interface between water and air, right? The water wants to stick to other molecules of water. It doesn't want to just float in the air, right? That's why water beads up into little bubbles like it does. That's why insects can float on water like this and they don't fall into it. It's because the water wants to stick to itself, right? It doesn't want to be broken up and it doesn't want to have the air penetrate it. And that's what surface tension is, right? The water all wanting to stick to itself. And so in the lungs, what you have is a barrier between air and water, right? All the mucus in the lungs and stuff like that. And so normally, within that barrier, that water would want to all collapse in on itself, right? And it would suck the alveoli in, and they just stick to each other, right? So if you think about, like, if you take a microscope slide and another microscope slide, you put a drop of water on one of them, and then you stick the two microscope slides together, they really want to be stuck together, and they're hard to peel apart, and that's because of the surface tension of that water, okay? And so we don't want that to happen in our alveoli. We don't want them to collapse and be really hard to open up and fill with air. And so that's why we need surfactant in there. What it's going to do is reduce that surface tension so that they're really easy to blow back up with air after they're emptied of air. Okay, so that's just really important. And hyaline membrane disease is basically just something that happens in premature babies because surfactant is one of the last things that gets produced in an infant or in a neonate or whatever. And that's basically just because, your lungs you're not using when you're in the womb, right? You don't use them until you're born. So they wait until the last minute to form surfactant. So if you are a premature baby, a lot of the times they haven't formed this yet. And so they can develop hyaline membrane disease. It's really hard for them to breathe. And that's just because they don't have that surfactant. Okay. These are just some quick things for you guys to know for your quiz. Bronchoalveolar fluid contains antibodies, collagenase, and other enzymes, right? And all of those things are just antibacterial, okay? They just help to prevent you from getting infections in your lungs, pneumonia in your lungs, in the bronchoalveolar fluid. And then you also have macrophages, and they produce this thing called hemosiderin. And basically what that is it just helps your lung heal itself. If you ever have any hemorrhage or anything like that, they can produce that, and it helps it kind of heal in on itself and stuff like that. Okay, so just some natural defenses of the respiratory system, right? So those really thin barriers that you have within the lungs make it really easy for germs and bacteria and everything to get through those barriers and into your blood, right? So it's really easy to get sick and get infections in your lungs and through your respiratory system. And so that's why we have all that mucus and everything to protect your respiratory system, and that's why we have all these natural defenses of our respiratory system. Okay, so just some examples of those are like your nose hairs. Those are going to trap really large particles like pollen, dirt, dust, stuff like that. You also have mucus constantly being produced in your respiratory system that we talked about. It has a lot of functions. It's antibacterial and stuff like that. But it lines our respiratory system and keeps out those harmful particles as well. We also have coughing, right? That's a natural defense of the respiratory system. And so that just forcibly expels foreign particles that can be trapped in our lungs and airways, right? And that's why if you get sick, if your body's like, oh my gosh, I'm inhaling all these germs, you have all this inflammatory stuff going on in your lungs. That's why you have to cough, is because your body is irritated in your lungs, and so it's trying to cough up whatever you are inhaling and all the mucus you have down there. That's also why we have sneezing, right? If that happens in your nose, it's to try to clear out forcibly all of that bacteria and mucus that can be trapped in your nasal passages. Okay, so that's the end. So we'll do some practice. So which characteristics of a bronchus match its/their images? And remember we said bronchus or bronchi have cartilage, right? Incomplete cartilage plates. So A is pointing to, it says, simple ciliated columnar epithelium with goblet cells. So we do have respiratory epithelium in our bronchus. But remember we said respiratory epithelium is going to be that pseudostratified columnar epithelium, right? So not simple columnar, pseudostratified columnar. It is ciliated and it does have goblet cells, but it's pseudostratified, right? So that one's going to be wrong. B, cartilage plate. So we already said we have cartilage plates in the bronchus, and yes, this is an example of a cartilage plate. This is hyaline cartilage in here around parts of your bronchus. C, it says nerve and glands in the lamina propria. So these are glands in the lamina propria right here, but this is actually not nerve, right? This is smooth muscle. This isn't nerve. So C is wrong. Okay. So our answer is going to be B for that one, just the cartilage plates. So this one, which cells / images best match? So A, this is pointing to a really fat, plump cell in the lungs, right? And so we said the fat, plump ones are going to be the ones producing things. Those are going to be our type 2 pneumocytes that are producing that surfactant, right? B, so this is a really big cell and it's kind of projecting off into the airway space right here. So this is going to be an air macrophage, and you can even see it has all of these little granules in it from things that it's eaten, right? So those are going to be air macrophages right there. So that one is right as well. C, so it's pointing to this really flat cell, and it's saying type 1 pneumocyte. And remember, we did say type 1 pneumocytes are really flat cells, but we also said that the lung has endothelium, like all your other organs, and those are really flat cells, right? And so the way I know this is not a type 1 pneumocyte is because what it's lining is a blood vessel, right? So if it's lining a blood vessel, it has to be endothelium. It's not a type 1 pneumocyte. So a type 1 pneumocyte might be one like this right here, or something else somewhere around here that's not around a blood vessel. But since this one's clearly around a blood vessel, you can see all these red blood cells within the blood vessel. That's going to be an endothelial cell. So C does not match. It's going to be D, A, and B. Okay, next one, which match in the nasal cavity? So A is pointing to this right here, and it's saying it's bone, and that's correct. You do have bone in the later parts of your nose, in the more caudal parts of your nose. So that is bone tissue right there. B is saying is elastic cartilage. And so this is cartilage. You do also have cartilage and bone in your nose, but this is hyaline cartilage right here in the later parts of your nose. So that's hyaline cartilage, not elastic cartilage. So B does not match. C is pointing to these bundles right here, and it's saying that's smooth muscle. That is not correct. Remember, we said this is nervous tissue, right? These are little nerve bundles under your olfactory epithelium, right? Go into your brain to tell you what you smell, and these would be Bowman's glands, right? So the only one that matches would be A. Okay, this one, which structure function matches? So ciliated cells and goblet cell secretions help to clean air. Yes, that is correct, right? We said that mucus and those cilia constantly brushing back and forth to pick up the mucus that's picking up particles, that's going to help clean air, yes. Goblet cells and mucus glands help humidify air, yes. Remember we said that mucus from the Bowman's glands as well as from the goblet cells help humidify air in the conducting portion of your respiratory system, so yes. Pseudostratified columnar with ciliated cells and goblet cells are for olfaction. That one is incorrect, right? Because for olfaction, that would be your olfactory epithelium, not your respiratory epithelium. And this is what respiratory epithelium is, right? Pseudostratified columnar with cilia and goblet cells. So that one's just going to be D. This one is doing some matching. So which paired drawings and real images match? So A, up here, you can see this is a diagram of respiratory epithelium, right? And I know that because it's pseudostratified columnar. There's some goblet cells in here. These are the goblet cells. And there's cilia on the top. So that's respiratory epithelium. And this one down here is olfactory epithelium, right? There's no goblet cells. It is pseudostratified columnar, but there's no cilia on top. And you can also see some Bowman's glands and stuff on the bottom. So that's going to be olfactory. So those don't match, okay? This one right here, so this one is olfactory, so this would match right here. But up here, this is respiratory epithelium, right? So those would match because you can see clearly all that cilia up there. And this is pseudostratified. Can't see a good example of a goblet cell, but maybe there's one in there. So those do not match, right? If these were matching and these were matching, that would be correct, but they're switched. And then this one, this is stratified squamous epithelium, right? Lots of layers, very flat at the top. Stratified squamous epithelium, lots of layers, very flat at the top. So the only one that matches is C, because A and B are switched. Okay, and that's the end. Hopefully this was helpful for you guys. And yeah, have a good week.